Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajmain amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear brothers and sisters and friends, welcome to the Riba series, and in this particular episode, we'll be discussing and reviewing the warnings against riba in the Qur'an. Unlike the previous session and the previous episode where we looked at the revelation of riba and how riba was prohibited and the verses of riba revealed across the life of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but in this particular episode we'll be looking at specifically what are the warnings, the admonitions in regard to riba in the Qur'an. How has Allah warned us from riba in the Qur'an? What's the language like? What are the messages and meanings pertaining to that? The first verse, which was the first verse revealed in regard to riba in the 7th year after the Messenger of Allah received prophethood and revelation, is this particular verse in Surah Al-Rum, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وما آتيتم من ربا ليربو في أموال الناس فلا يربو عند الله وما آتيتم من زكاة تريدون وجه الله فأولئك هم المضعفون. This is in Surah Al-Rum. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that whatever you lend out in usury to gain value through other people's wealth will not increase in the sight of Allah. But whatever you give in charity, in your desire for Allah's approval, will earn multiple rewards. This hinges and rests upon a Muslim's worldview, the very worldview which Islam is based upon, that whatever you do in this world will have an implication of your welfare in the hereafter. Your welfare in the hereafter is contingent on your actions in this world. And so this verse directs our thinking, our minds, to the real life, to the eternal life. That don't think of these transactions as merely things you're doing in this world. These transactions you may be transacting in the world, you may be exploiting others, you may be receiving funds. Whatever you're doing in this world, there's a direct correlation and a relationship between what you're doing here and what happens to you tomorrow there. And so, if this is our worldview is of accountability in the hereafter. Our worldview is of giving account to Allah, of answering and responding to Allah's questions, and being brought forward in the court of Allah, having a reckoning in the hereafter. If that's our worldview and our belief, then this very verse that we have in front of us is sufficient to discourage us and warn us against riba altogether. That if I deal in riba in this world, then it's not accepted, it doesn't increase in the sight of Allah. It's not something which Allah is pleased with. It's not something which is blessed in the sight of Allah. And therefore it's something which has no real value and intrinsic worth insofar as the hereafter is concerned. And from an Islamic lens, from the lens of the hereafter, this practice is blameworthy. It's destructive. It's not in my favor. And as we mentioned, there is no need then for a legal kind of prohibition. Those with firm faith and those who truly seek the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, such a verse is sufficient for them to abstain from riba. Because a Muslim is one who submits to Allah, who loves Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The sign of a believer is the intense love for Allah. وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَشَدُّ حُبًّا لِلَّهِ. That's the sign of believers. Allah mentions in the Qur'an, in Surah Al-Baqarah, that those who believe are intense in their love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if our love is intense for Allah, if something doesn't please Allah, and it's not something that He accepts, then we should abstain from that practice altogether. So this is the first verse, which is not a legal prohibition as such. Rather, it's you could say the peak and the kind of like ultimate discouragement for a believer and a lover of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that this practice is not pleasing to Allah. It's not something which will increase in the sight of Allah, because Allah, whatever good we do, that increases in the sight of Allah. Allah blesses us. We gain in this world, we gain in the hereafter. Allah is so merciful that every good we do is not neglected or overlooked. Every good action, whether it's a small action you do in the darkness of night where nobody knows, you may give some charity, or you may say a good word to somebody, or you may perform some prayers, or you may help somebody in the darkness of night where nobody else knows. You do something, Allah will reward you on that as well. Nothing is hidden from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You may be helping a creature in the darkness of night. There's a creature nearby who's stuck, who's hurt, a pigeon or a bird, and you help, you free it, you release it. It's stuck, it's got hurt, or an animal is starving. There's an animal, a cat wandering around and is starving. You give it some water, you do something. These types of actions, nobody may praise you, nobody may be even aware of such a practice or an action that you do, but it's not hidden from Allah. Allah is the all-seeing. Allah is Al-Basir. Allah is the all-seeing, all-knowing, Al-Alim. And therefore Allah will most certainly reward you for this. And so every good action results in reward, grace, love, and blessings and bounties from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this world and the hereafter. But if an action doesn't follow this pattern, this is the pattern, this is the law. This is like the what we call the sunnatullah, the law of Allah, like Allah's laws in this world. How Allah runs this world. This is the law of Allah. A believer who does good with the correct intention, according to the sunnah, he'll be rewarded. If a person, he does a sin, he'll get one evil deed written on his records. This is like the law. And so if something doesn't fulfill and follow this particular law, then there's something wrong with that practice. And that's what we learn from here, that by you engaging in riba, it's not following this pattern and law. You're not gaining in your account with Allah. There's no gain there. So clearly, this is not aligning with the principle and the pattern and the law of Allah, and therefore it cannot be something which is praiseworthy. So this is the first verse, which is about a believer understanding his relationship, that he functions more on and is more focused on what pleases Allah and what displeases Allah. It's not just about worldly actions. And this verse really connected the mind and directed the mind towards the idea that whatever we do in this world, any financial transaction, any economic practice we do, it has a direct impact and consequence on our affairs in the hereafter. So if we want welfare in the hereafter, we need to ensure that our economic activities, financial transactions, are sound. They are aligning with Sharia principles. The second verse, which is a very severe verse, and one of the only places in the Qur'an, right? And from all the prohibitions discussed in the Qur'an and all the different misdeeds and wrongdoings which are mentioned in the Qur'an, only one has a declaration of war next to it. Only one, and that's riba. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't declare war upon a person who does zina. Allah didn't declare war upon a person who murders other people. Allah doesn't declare war upon a person who's involved in gambling. War is not declared upon a person who is drinking and an alcoholic. Allah doesn't declare war on any of these practices. But war and the language of war and waging war was revealed in regard to riba. Allah mentions in the Quran, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu taqullah wa dharu ma baqiya min riba in kuntum mu'minin. that, O you who believe, fear Allah, right? And وَذَرُوا مَا بَقِيَ مِنَ الرِّبَى, give up what's due to you from riba if you are truly believers. فَإِن لَمْ تَفْعَلُوا, if you don't do this, فَأْذَنُوا بِحَرْبٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ, if you don't do this, then be informed of a war with Allah and His Messenger. وَإِن تُبْتُمْ فَلَكُمْ رُؤُوسُ أَمْوَالِكُمْ لَا تَظْلِمُونَ وَلَا تُظْلَمُونَ. If you do this particular, if you give up this practice, then you can retain your capital. لا تظلمون ولا تظلمون. You will not be oppressed. You will not oppress others by taking more than the capital that you've given to them. So if you've lent them £1,000, you can't oppress others and take 1,100. That's oppression. The extra premium interest is oppression. And neither will you be oppressed. ولا تظلمون. You will not be oppressed by receiving less than your principal amount. This is what this verse refers to, and this is the translation of the verse. But what we want to look at is the declaration of war that Allah mentions up here, and this is like the warning in the Qur'an, that those who engage in riba are in reality, they are declaring or trying to oppose Allah, and they are standing up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in war. And Allah informs them, you engage in riba, if you don't resist and if you don't put your arms down, your riba down, then you have a declaration of war with Allah and His Messenger. Yes, this was revealed with regards to Thaqif, the tribe of Thaqif in Ta'if, where after the conquest of Makkah in the 8th year of Hijrah, they wanted to retain the riba receivables on their books, and they were happy to forego and write off riba payables. So they wanted to continuously receive riba, but they were happy to stop paying riba. That was a deal that they wanted to broker and negotiate. And Allah mentioned, okay, if you want to go down this route, that is you're breaking the truce that you have with the believers. By you engaging in this practice, you are breaking your allegiance. And that's why there's a declaration of war, that there is no safety now if you engage in this particular way. That's in terms of the revelation and how it was revealed. But the learning, what do we have? That a person who engages in riba, he is being informed of war with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You have a war with somebody. I mean, you have an enemy, you have one person. Now, one person will not wage war against you. You'll have a fight, you'll have a face-off with that person, a confrontation maybe, and that person will harm you, hit you, he may do other things, he may threaten you, he may impact your, in this day and age, there's reputational risk. They can go on social media and say X, Y, Z about you, and they can put you in some harm's way. That's like a one-on-one kind of situation. You may have a couple of people who gang up on you, and they will again, try to harm you and try to do everything they can to lower you and afflict you with some form of harm. But then there's war. War is something on a completely different scale and a completely different level. War depletes your very foundation. A person who's fighting you one-on-one will not deplete your home, your assets, your socio-economic status. It will not impact your wealth really. Rather, it's just your personal kind of like worry that you have, personal injury, and maybe some reputational risk. Beyond that, there's not much that happens. But when war takes place, war uproots an entire civilization. War completely effaces your existence. Right? War diminishes your name and identity. Your buildings, your assets, your worth, your value, your pomp is completely obliterated and destroyed. If you look in history and you look at wars, what happens with wars, how many thousands are killed and murdered, how many thousands lose their homes, assets, names, identities are completely wiped off. But there's nothing remaining of you. It's as if you don't even exist, right? And so when Allah declares war, this is what we're talking about here. It's not, it's harm to yourself, to your person, or a bit of affliction. When you engage in war with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you are exposing yourself to complete obliteration. You are being completely wiped off. We are being exposed. A person who engages in riba, and he's exposing himself to being obliterated, to being completely effaced and wiped off, and to face a punishment which very few people would face in this world. That your entire identity, your assets, your foundations, your everything about you is completely diminished and wiped off. That's war with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So a person who engages in riba, temporarily he may have some kind of benefit, but long term they're in war with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and such a person can never ever, if he does not repent, then his outcome can never be prosperous and positive. His outcome will always be doom and gloom. So that's the declaration of war. So riba is equivalent to treason, and it's a matter of national security, right? Because when a person engages in riba, he's opposing and objecting to the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he is going against, because riba is a civilizational harm. When you engage in riba, you're impacting everyone's wealth. It's a macro issue, and therefore it's a civilizational harm, because we're looking at things at a macro level. It's not a micro issue. Riba is a macro issue. You're creating you're creating you're destabilizing the economy by engaging in riba. You are misallocating capital. You are exploiting. You're impacting the balance in the economy, and therefore at a macro level you are having civilizational harm. When you are having civilizational harm at a macro level, Allah is waging war, because war is a language of civilizations, and therefore you are committing an act of treason. You're going against the macro authority, and you are now doing something which is a matter of national security. You're a threat to the stability and peace at a macro level, and that's why there's this kind of language, and it's a declaration of war which is declared by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The next verse is a very interesting verse, and it's also a very fearful verse, in that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he describes the consumers of riba and their state in the hereafter. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he mentions that الَّذِينَ يَأْكُلُونَ الرِّبَا لَا يَقُومُونَ إِلَّا كَمَا يَقُومُ الَّذِي يَتَخَبَطُهُ الشَّيْطَانُ مِنَ الْمَسِّ. That those who consume interest will stand on the day of judgment like those driven to madness by Satan's touch. ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّهُمْ قَالُوا إِنَّمَا الْبَيْعُ مِثْلُ الرِّبَا. That is because they say trade is no different than interest. وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَا. But Allah has permitted trading and forbidden interest. فَمَنْ جَاءَهُ مُوعِظَةٌ مِّن رَبِّهِ فَانْتَهَى فَلَهُ مَا سَلَفَ وَأَمْرُهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ. Whoever refrains after having received warning from their Lord may keep their previous gains, and their case is left to Allah. Allah will decide what to do with them. وَمَنْ عَادَ فَأُولَٰئِكَ أَصْحَابُ النَّارِ هُمْ فِيهَا خَالِدُونَ. As for those who persist, it is they who will be the residents of the fire. They will be there forever. So this is one of the key verses where a punishment in regard to riba is mentioned in the hereafter. Of course, we have punishments mentioned in the Hadith, but this starts mentioning the punishments on the Day of Judgment, let alone in hellfire. This is referring to the Day of Judgment. From there, really, the issues of riba begin, and even in the grave, the issues of riba begin, because we know that in the grave, people who have good deeds, they'll be enveloped and benefiting from their good deeds in the grave. Those who are overwhelmed with wrongdoing and evil, they'll be exposed to the wrath and the evil of their sins in the grave too. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then, in this particular verse, although the scholars mention that this is referring to the non-Muslims who dealt in riba and were engaging in riba, Ibn Abbas radiyallahu anhuma, he mentions that such verses, although they refer primarily and they're addressing non-Muslims who are engaged in riba, the warning is for Muslims too. Just because they are Muslims, it doesn't mean that they are absolved and not addressed by such verses. They are also addressed by such verses. So the question arises that what does it mean when the Qur'an says that they are like those driven, that they'll stand on the day of judgment like those driven to madness by Satan's touch? What does that mean? The scholars have mentioned different views. The first kind of understanding of this verse is that these people will be raised on the day of judgment in a state of insanity. When the trumpet is blown on the day of judgment, everybody will be coming out of their graves, and they will be going forth to the plane of resurrection, or to the plane of reckoning. So they'll be resurrected and going forth towards the plane of reckoning. At that particular time, people will want to go quickly, right? But these people, they'll be in a state of insanity. And even on the day of judgment, there's so many horrors. We know that the sun will be so close to people. The sun will be so close to people. Imagine the heat. People will be sweating in the sins. The darkness, the kind of like the trials and the terror and the horror of the day of judgment. When you're being afflicted by all of these and there's no death, there is no death at that particular time to escape any of the horror. These people will be insane. They will not be able to navigate. They won't know what's going on. Insanity, you don't know where you're going, what you're doing, where you're heading. You don't know what's happening in so far as like where to go, what to do. But you're feeling everything. You're feeling it all, but you are almost lost in your own mind. You have a state of insanity. You're lost in your mind. You don't know where to go, where to look, what to do, but you're feeling everything that's happening to you. So it's as if you are, blind in the hereafter. You can't see. Your insanity has kind of overpowered your mental faculty and your cognitive abilities. So you can't fathom the intensity of what's happening around. But that doesn't mean you've escaped the punishment. Rather, it's even more severe because now you can't even anticipate. By seeing things, you have at least a moment of anticipation to prepare yourself. When you can't see something, everything that happens is sudden. And therefore you're being whacked and whipped one after the other, suddenly with so many torments and horrors continuously. That's the first kind of understanding, that these people will raise on the day of judgment, and they'll arise and stand on the day of judgment as though they are insane. Why is this the particular punishment for them in the hereafter on the day of judgment? Because they were insane after the wealth of others. They wanted to consume and exploit the wealth of others with insanity. They had so much passion on doing this. It's like how we say that this person is insane. Like his work ethic is insane. And he's always at it. So we use the word insanity to refer to people's kind of persistence. And so these people, because they were persistent in consuming the wealth of others and devouring and exploiting others, Allah will raise them on the day of judgment in a state of insanity. They were insane after the wealth of others. On the day of judgment, they themselves will really be insane and be afflicted by insanity. That's the first understanding of this verse. The second understanding, which the scholars mention, is on the day of judgment, everybody, Allah says in the Quran, وَيُسْرِعُونَ, they'll be running. They'll be running on the day of judgment to the plane of reckoning and the station of reckoning. Why? Because everybody wants their reckoning to be done quickly so that they can be saved from the torment of the day of judgment. So everybody will run, and they'll be pushed along and ushered by angels to go forward to the plane of reckoning. Everybody will want to quickly go there as they're being guided forward and pushed along. These people who engaged in riba, whilst they'll want to also go quickly to the plane of resurrection or the plane of reckoning, and be free from their accounts and go through that reckoning. It's like standing in a line of a test, right? We've all been in these types of scenarios where if you have to take a test, or you're in the immigration line, you just arrived in a country, and you fear the questioning at immigration. You quickly just want to get through immigration and get on the other side. So you just quickly want to pass the barriers and go on the immigration controls and the desks, show your passport and go through. You don't want to wait in that queue, especially if you are hesitant, or unfortunately with Muslims, we're always picked upon, and there's always some kind of like profiling done against Muslims. So Muslims feel this the most typically, where we are profiled, stopped, questioned for nothing. So when that's the case, that fear that Muslims feel and we shouldn't fear this, have faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this reckoning in the world is nothing compared to the hereafter. So we just like we want to quickly go through immigration and be freed from the questioning. Imagine the reckoning and the questioning on the Day of Judgment, how people will just want to quickly absolve themselves and get through that particular questioning and be freed from it and get to the other side, get to paradise and just get to the other side. So people will come out of their graves and rush. But these people, because of the riba will be heavy, it will be a burden upon them in their stomachs. It will be holding them down. And as a result, they will be towards the end of the queues. And therefore, they'll be subjected to all the horrors of the Day of Judgment. They'll be subjected to it, and they will experience all of it longer than most people. They'll be there on the Day of Judgment. So that's the second understanding of this particular verse. The third kind of interpretation of this verse is that these people, when it refers to them standing as if they've been driven to madness by shaitan, the scholars mention that it refers to this idea of them really being veiled and deprived from the mercy of Allah on the Day of Judgment. So these people, they'll be standing on the Day of Judgment as if they are acquaintances of shaitan, and because you're an acquaintance of the devil, you are deprived of all mercy on the Day of Judgment and the last day. In fact, the scholars mentioned there'll be a hijab, there'll be like a veil which will block them out from engaging with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and seeing and experiencing His mercy. They will be barred from that. So these are the different meanings. All of them are applicable because they each happen at a different stage. And this is really important. What we also learn from this verse, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّهُمْ قَالُوا إِنَّمَا الْبَيْعُ مِثْلُ الرِّبَا وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَا. From this verse, we also learn that we should not speak on matters of Islam which we have not studied deeply. And this is a very common problem, that any person will say, yeah, I think this, I think that, or they'll be very confident in voicing their views, even sometimes giving a fatwa, even though they say, oh yeah, I'm not a scholar, I'm not a mufti, but this is the answer. That is also an answer you're giving, right? This verse tells us this was what the people of Quraysh did, or the non-Muslims at the time. They were doing this. They were saying that what's the difference between bay' and riba? It's the same thing. How many times do we hear this from Muslims as well? Practitioners. We hear, oh yeah, it's the same. These transactions are the same. This is what exactly the non-Muslims were saying. Allah rebuts that and says, no, it's not the same. وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَا. Just because it seems the outcomes, the non-Muslims were just looking at the economics and the outcomes of the transaction, saying, look, it's the same thing. Allah is saying, don't judge things by the outcomes. Allah has said, أَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَا. To you, it may seem similar. The outcome is similar because they were referring to the outcomes and the kind of like economics and the commercials of the transaction. Allah is saying, no, they are not the same. Allah has permitted trade and forbidden interest. Even though the outcome and economics to a large degree would be similar, the process is completely different. One is done through a manner which is permitted by Allah. The other is done through a manner which is displeasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is like a warning for all of us to refrain from speaking on matters which we are not learned upon, especially when it comes to these types of matters, making claims about the Shari'a or matters of fiqh. If we have not studied fiqh in depth and have expertise in fiqh, then we should not be speaking on matters of fiqh. It's detrimental. It causes more confusion today than anything else. Yes, if you have expertise in certain areas, like you're a tax advisor, speak about tax. No one will challenge you. That's your strength. You should support the financial industry and Islamic finance through your tax advice. If you are a lawyer, focus on your legal work and support Islamic finance through your legal work and your legal strength. If you are an economist, focus and support Islamic finance through your economic insights. But we should all know our roles and support the effort together. So the same thing as fiqh. The faqih and the jurist, his concern is the Shari'a and law and giving fatwa. That's his role, that's his domain. So he will not be advising on tax. He will not be advising on legal structures and jurisdictions and how to structure particular transactions. His focus is Shari'a. That's his domain and his realm. He's put in the years of study to do that particular thing. He now has been, he has the opportunity to do so. You put your time into a particular thing, you do that. So it's very important we understand this, because this is where many unnecessary confusions arise when it comes to Sharia, when it comes to understanding and learning. So that's a very strong verse in the Quran. And another verse in the Quran which also talks about riba and how riba destroys wealth. This is a verse which refers to this world and the hereafter. Allah mentions, يَمْحَقُ اللَّهُ الرِّبَى وَيُرْبِي الصَّدَقَاتِ. This is all one passage, what we read previously, the previous verse, and this verse. There's many verses all together in Surah Al-Baqarah talking about riba. That's why scholars mention that many of the principles of wealth have been captured in Surah Al-Baqarah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, يَمْحَقُ اللَّهُ الرِّبَى وَيُرْبِي الصَّدَقَاتِ وَاللَّهُ لَا يُحِبُّ كُلَّ كَفَارٍ أَثِيمٍ. Allah deprives interest of all blessings, whereas He blesses charity with growth, and Allah does not like any ungrateful evildoer. What does this mean? And how does Allah destroy and deprive interest of blessings? So the destructive nature of riba is in this world and the hereafter as follows. So in this world, riba will eventually lead to financial difficulties and hardship. If your wealth is not depleted in this world, then the person will endure reputational risk and reputational harm. This is what the scholars mention in this verse, that riba has no positive outcome. Either you will suffer financial loss eventually. That's one outcome. Number two, if Allah does not give you financial loss, you'll suffer another form of loss, which is reputational risk and reputational harm. You will be impacted by some scandal, some issue, or some matter which will completely take your peace of mind away. Why do people gather wealth? People have wealth to get access to opportunities, ultimately for happiness and peace of mind, right? But this wealth will not be giving you a peace of mind or any kind of serenity and tranquility. Rather, it will be a means of worry, of concern, of stress, anxiety, and ultimately reputational risk. The third impact of engaging riba in this world, the scholars mention that the poor and the oppressed borrowers will curse the riba lenders, which will destroy all baraka from their wealth. Because of this curse from the poor and needy, when they see you exploiting them, when they see you take advantage of them, they will cry out to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and say to Allah, "Oh Allah, deal with this person. You deal with this person who's exploiting us, who's taking advantage of us, who is not having any mercy upon us. So they are cursing you and they are supplicating against you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That alone, because there's no barrier between the oppressed person and Allah. Du'as are accepted readily by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when it's made by the oppressed people. So these people are oppressed, who are at the at the helm or at the mercy of these lenders. They are oppressed because these riba lenders are exploiting them. And so when they make dua and supplicate to Allah, their prayers are answered. And we'll look at Baraka, what it is, in the next slide. But it's enough to say that your assets, your wealth will not be of great use to you in this world, and of course not in the hereafter either. Number 4, the riba dealer becomes exposed to others wanting to deprive him of his wealth. This is a fourth outcome which the scholars mention, that when Allah mentions يَمْحَقُ اللَّهُ riba, it means that the person dealing in riba, because of him amassing wealth, people's eyes will be upon his wealth. People's eyes will be upon him. And people will plot and ploy on how to take a piece of that wealth. So either legally or illegally, or efforts will be made to kind of deprive that person from his wealth and snatch his wealth away. And as a result, that person who's dealing in riba will be drowned in anxiety, stress, and worries, because his wealth is never safe. He's always having to defend others and having to defend his wealth, always having to defend his wealth against others. So that's in regard to the nature and destructive nature of riba in this world. In regard to the hereafter, the scholars mentioned that a person who deals in riba, how does Allah destroy riba and that person in the hereafter then? Number 1, that person, Allah will not accept his sadaqah. Any good deed he does like sadaqah, it will not be accepted in the hereafter. This is one view of scholars. Second is, his worldly wealth will not be of any use to him in the hereafter. The reason why we engage in good practices, good deeds, and amass resources in this world is ultimately for the hereafter. Right? Everything that we amass, engage in, is for the hereafter. We live in this house, we live in a home, we work, we do all these things ultimately so that we can chart our course and navigate our journey to the hereafter to support us in that ultimate goal and ultimate aim. So we fulfill our needs in this world so that we are able then to focus on the hereafter and develop our eternal life. But people who are engaged in riba, their resources will be of no use to them whatsoever. The third view and opinion mentioned by scholars is that the people who engage in riba, they will be, and this is similar to what we mentioned earlier about when they will be burdened with riba on the Day of Judgment. The scholars mentioned that the poor people will be amongst the first to enter paradise. They'll enter paradise 500 years before the wealthy will enter paradise. And when we say the wealthy, we're talking about those who amassed and earned their wealth in a halal way. So the poor people will enter paradise 500 years before the wealthy people. Just imagine that, 500 years in advance. So the poor people will go through quickly the Day of Judgment. The believers, of course, who had very little resources and in this world they struggled. But they were patient and they believed in the promise of Allah. Such people will enter paradise very quickly on the Day of Judgment. Their reckoning will be very quick because they have nothing. In this world, they had very little resources and they just submitted and surrendered to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. On the Day of Judgment, they'll be taken straight to the gates of paradise and made to enter paradise. 500 years before, for 500 years, they'll be enjoying the bounties of paradise, living in paradise. Whereas these people, the wealthy Muslims, also God-fearing, also pious, also earn their wealth in a halal way, they'll still won't have entered paradise. They'll be going through the reckoning, traversing the bridge, coming to the gates, and then eventually entering paradise. That will take 500 years of a journey. But the poor will be expedited. It'll be like a VIP pass or fast track, like how you go to an airport and there's a fast track service. When there's a huge rush, it's the holiday season, there's lines upon lines to go through security. That's when fast track is really beneficial, because you get to skip the entire queue, right? And you're straight through. The poor people will also experience a fast track service on the Day of Judgment. Allah will give them fast track, and that they will go straight through. But the people with all the wealth and baggages that they had in this world, they'll have to wait and go through security and scanning, because everything will then be reviewed. How did you use these? Like the Hadith tells us that the people will have to answer questions, right? Where did you earn your wealth and where did you spend it? Right? What did you do with the knowledge that you had? So the different questions that people will be asked on the Day of Judgment. So the believers who amassed wealth in a lawful way, they'll enter 500 years later. Imagine the state of those people who amassed wealth unlawfully with riba. If the believers are entering 500 years later and they're being freed from all the kind of trials and security and testing on the Day of Judgment, and it's taken them that long time, imagine the affair and the circumstance and the situation of the people engaged in riba and unlawful wealth generation. How they will be right at the end. And we read previously, just right now, that they'll be burdened with the weight of riba, holding them back from proceeding and going forward. And so this ties in with that kind of understanding that they'll be right at the back, at the end, having to suffer the torment, horror, and trials of the Day of Judgment. Further, when it comes to charity, although we spoke about riba, Allah mentions in this verse, وَيُرْبِ الصَّدَقَاتِ. What's the benefit of charity in this world? He gets the support from Allah as he's supporting Allah's creation. What this verse means is that just as this person is supporting the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this world, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will support him in this world. Number two, Allah increases the love and honor of this person in the world daily. So because you are doing good, Allah will increase your love, the respect, the honor, your dignity. People will flock towards you with positivity. People will look up to you. That's the benefit of giving charity. Number three, the poor supporting with praise and supplication. Where the poor supplicated against and cursed the riba dealers, the poor people will be your support and they'll pray for you. And these are the poor people who will be entering paradise first. So imagine benefiting from their prayers. Imagine benefiting from their supplication. How powerful it will be. Number four, giving charity in this world, another benefit is you'll be safeguarded from the evil of people as they empathize with him and hold him in high regard. So unlike the person who was dealing in riba, where people had their eyes on his wealth, a person who gives out his wealth to people will not envy him as such, because they'll say, look, this person is just spending his money in charity. He's not building huge buildings or buying flashy cars or doing X, Y, and Z and being extravagant with his wealth. Rather, he is feeding the poor, helping the needy, and just spending his wealth in these paths and these avenues. So forget him. Allah will divert people's attention away from you and your wealth, and that will be a safeguarding for you and your wealth. And of course, the benefit in the hereafter, the sadaqah is multiplied, right? It's multiplied numerously in the hereafter. And also, your sadaqah and giving in charity will be a means of various resources being gained in paradise, in Jannah. So you'll have access to so many resources in the hereafter because of sadaqah. You'll have more things, more resources, more assets which will be acquired as a result of sadaqah which you gave in this world. So just quickly on Baraka, what is Baraka and how does Baraka impact your resources? Baraka linguistically means increase, growth, continuity, and establishment. Baraka is a metaphysical energy. That's how you can understand it in our kind of language and the world that we live in today. It's like a metaphysical energy which is embedded into activities, resources, and time. So it's like a metaphysical energy which embeds itself in time, in your body, in your health, in your wealth, and that creates some kind of elasticity and some kind of depth in these resources. It is a divine blessing from Allah and solely granted by Allah to those who seek Him and His pleasure. So what impact does it have? Number one is prolonged use and longer shelf life. So because of Baraka, Allah creates depth and width in your assets and resources. Your assets are far more useful for a prolonged time compared to others. Number two, relatively more beneficial for you. You may have a plate of rice as an example. That will keep you more saturated and full, relatively more than those with the same plate of rice. So they may feel hungry after 2 hours, 3 hours. You will not feel hungry for a number of hours compared to such people. So Allah will grant you a kind of a greater benefit from the resources that you are benefiting from. Allah will put more benefit therein, and therefore you'll be able to survive and benefit from those assets longer. Number three, increased output in reduced time periods. When Baraka is embedded into time, the consequence and the result of that is you'll be able to achieve much more in shorter amount of time compared to other people. So because of Baraka that you have, you'll be able to do much more. People will be amazed and shocked. How can you do so much in so less time? Like you read about the pious people like Imam Nawawi rahimahullah. He passed away at the age of about 45. But look how much he did, rahimahullah, in such a short time span. Other scholars as well. Many of them lived relatively short lives compared to other people, but the amount of output and productivity was mind-blowing. That's an example of Baraka. Number four, there's a stronger layer of protection and preservation. Your assets and resources will be protected and preserved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As a result, where other people will be exposed and their assets will be damaged quickly, your assets will be protected and preserved as a result of Baraka. That's why Baraka is what we should seek. Along with increase in wealth and blessings in wealth, we seek Baraka. We ask Allah that Allah grant us Baraka in wealth, because you can have all the wealth in the world, but if that wealth is diminished quickly, it's not beneficial, there's not much output, and there's no protection or preservation, that wealth is really useless. And the final verse on riba in the Qur'an, where Allah warns in regard to unlawful earnings and unlawful wealth, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He reproaches and He says in regard to the Rabbaniyun and Ahbar, who are the scholars of the Injil and scholars of Torah, so the Christian scholars and the Jewish scholars, that why did they not forbid others, right, when they spoke in a sinful manner and when they consumed unlawfully, how evil their deeds are. So Allah is blaming them as well, that the knowledgeable people are rebuked and reproached that despite having the ability and authority to prohibit this and tell people that it is wrong, they never did so. So this is them being reproached by Allah, that how you had the knowledge, you knew what the Torah and what the Injil says, and yet you did not say anything. You let people engage in all these vices and ills and evils. So this is again another warning for people who are aware of riba and the harm of riba, to speak against it, to warn other people about riba, to tell people not to engage in riba. Ibn Abbas radiyallahu anhu mentions that this is the most severe verse revealed addressing the people of knowledge. Allah brings the perpetrator of evil and those who don't condemn together in blame. So those people who engaged in riba, And those who didn't engage in riba, but simply didn't say anything, they were happy, they didn't even confront them or scold them or warn them. They just stayed quiet and just let things happen. Allah brings everybody together in one verse and puts them together in blame. Now, how evil is this practice? Because if there's nobody warning against it, there'll be more and more people who will enter and engage in this particular activity. And that's why this side is needed as well to warn. They need to warn and need to educate and tell people that this is wrong, it's unethical, it's harmful. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us from all the harms of riba, and may Allah give us the strength and ability to warn against riba and all evil practices which are detrimental for humanity. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.